The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door of Marcus Hayes's trailer at 2 in the morning like a ghost calling card. He found it when he stumbled home from his graveyard shift at the warehouse, boots caked in mud, flannel shirt soaked through with sweat despite the January cold. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that lawyers used when they wanted you to know they charged by the hour. Marcus set his thermos down on the counter, the coffee inside long since gone cold. He turned the envelope over in his calloused hands, studying the return address embossed in gold lettering. Bryce and Associates, Charleston, West Virginia. No first-class stamp, no postmark. Someone had delivered this by hand in the dead of night to a trailer park where nobody came unless they were lost or desperate. Sophie coughed from the back bedroom, a wet, rattling sound that made Marcus's jaw clench. 4 years old, and already she knew what it meant to fight for every breath. Congenital heart defect, the doctors called it, speaking in careful tones that translated to a single truth. Without surgery, she wouldn't see her 5th birthday. The surgery cost $180,000. Insurance wouldn't cover experimental procedures, even when they were the only option left. Marcus ripped open the envelope. The letter inside was brief, typed on letterhead that matched the envelope's formality. 3 sentences that changed everything and nothing all at once. Dear Mr. Hayes, I represent the estate of Vivian Thorne, deceased. As her sole surviving relative, you are the beneficiary of her primary residence, Iron Gate Manor, located in Summit County. Please contact my office to arrange transfer of deed and discuss outstanding legal obligations. The name triggered a memory so faint Marcus almost dismissed it as imagination. Vivian Thorne. His great-aunt, maybe? A woman he'd met once or twice as a child decades ago in a house that loomed like a cathedral carved from stone. He remembered cold rooms and colder silence, and eyes that saw too much. He hadn't known she was dead. He hadn't known she remembered him. Ranger lifted his head from the worn rug, ears rotating toward the door. The German Shepherd had been Marcus's partner in Kandahar, trained to detect explosives and threats most humans missed. Now retired, the dog still worked, still watched, still protected. His growl was low and constant, a warning that vibrated through the floor. The knock came 3 seconds later, not loud but deliberate, the kind of knock that expected to be answered. Marcus opened the door to find a man in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus earned in 6 months. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, with the posture of someone who'd never questioned whether the world would bend to accommodate him. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and extended the other for a handshake Marcus didn't take. The man's smile didn't falter. Professional disappointment. Practiced and perfect. Mr. Hayes, I'm Quentin Bryce. I apologize for the hour, but this matter requires immediate attention. May I come in? Marcus shifted his weight, blocking the doorway. Ranger moved to his left side, positioned exactly where training dictated. The dog's hackles were raised, a ridge of silver-gray fur along his spine. It's 2 in the morning. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. I'm not selling anything. I'm delivering an inheritance. Iron Gate Manor, 23 acres, appraised at $2.3 million. It's yours, Mr. Hayes, or it will be, once we navigate certain legal complexities. The number should have meant something, should have sparked hope or relief or at least curiosity. Instead, Marcus felt only the weight of the phrase legal complexities, which in his experience meant problems that money could solve, and he didn't have money. What kind of complexities? Bryce glanced past Marcus into the trailer, taking in the peeling linoleum, the secondhand furniture, the medical bills stacked on the kitchen table in a paper tower of desperation. When he looked back at Marcus, something shifted in his expression. Not quite pity, but close enough to sting. Perhaps we could discuss this in aid. I have documents you will want to review. Perhaps you could answer the question. Bryce's smile thinned. He set the briefcase on the ground and extracted a manila folder, holding it out like an offering. Marcus took it, but didn't open it. Not yet. The property has an outstanding tax lien. $1.8 million accumulated over several decades due to a disputed assessment. Your aunt contested it for years, but never resolved it before her death. As the new owner, that debt transfers to you. The words landed like body blows. $2.3 million in value, $1.8 million in debt. which left $500,000 if he could even sell a property that came with that kind of anchor tied around its neck. And $500,000 would save Sophie, pay off the medical bills, maybe even leave enough to start over somewhere the cold didn't seep through every wall. But Bryce wasn't finished. There's also the matter of immediate maintenance. The structure has been uninhabited for 2 years. According to county inspectors, it's currently uninhabitable without significant repairs. Those repairs are estimated at $50,000 minimum before you could legally occupy or sell the property. Marcus closed the folder without looking inside. The math was simple and brutal. He'd inherit debt he couldn't pay and a house he couldn't afford to fix or sell. A perfect trap wrapped in expensive paper and delivered in the middle of the night by a man who'd never missed a meal or watched his child struggle to breathe. Why tell me this now? Why not mail it like normal people? Because there's someone who wants to buy the property, a private buyer willing to assume all debts and pay you $200,000 for your trouble. The offer expires in 7 days. After that, the county will initiate foreclosure proceedings and you'll receive nothing. $200,000, enough to save Sophie, enough to keep living in this trailer where the heat barely worked and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments. Enough to stay stuck, stay small, stay exactly where he'd been since the day he came home from Afghanistan with Ranger, and a discharge that felt more like abandonment than honor. Who's the buyer? I'm not at liberty to disclose that information, but I can assure you the offer is legitimate and time-sensitive. Marcus handed the folder back. Bryce didn't take it. I need to think about it. Of course. But Mr. Hayes, if I may offer some advice, your aunt lived in that house for 80 years. She died alone in a care facility because she refused to sell it, refused to let anyone help her, refused to accept that sometimes holding on is the same as giving up. Don't make her mistake. Take the money. Save your daughter. Let someone else worry about the ghosts. Ranger's growl deepened. Marcus's hand dropped to the dog's head, fingers tangling in warm fur. The animal was trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of restraint. Dogs didn't react this way to ordinary threats. They reacted this way to danger they couldn't see but knew was there, hidden in plain sight. I'll call your office when I decide. Bryce nodded, smoothing his tie, though it didn't need smoothing. He picked up his briefcase and turned to go, then paused at the edge of the small porch. One more thing. The property is currently under surveillance by a private security firm. For insurance purposes, you understand, they've been instructed to prevent unauthorized entry until ownership is formally transferred. If you decide to visit before signing the paperwork, please contact my office first. We'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings. He left before Marcus could ask what kind of abandoned house needed armed guards, what kind of surveillance protected empty rooms and dust. The question followed Marcus through the rest of that sleepless night. It whispered through the morning routine of making Sophie breakfast, crushing her pills into applesauce because she couldn't swallow them whole, listening to the wet rattle of her breathing and pretending everything was fine. It echoed through his shift at the warehouse, through the repetitive violence of loading trucks and unloading freight, while his mind circled the same impossible math. $200,000 to walk away, or $2.3 million in asset value, $1.8 million in debt, and a mystery that smelled wrong in ways he couldn't name, but Ranger had recognized immediately. By Thursday, Marcus had made up his mind. By Friday morning, he was loading Sophie into his truck, Ranger alert in the back seat, the address to Iron Gate Manor programmed into his phone even though he still remembered the way. Remembered the winding road that climbed into the mountains. Remembered the forest that pressed close like it wanted to swallow the path. Remembered the moment when the trees parted and the house appeared like something conjured from stone and shadow and stubbornness. Sophie pressed her face against the window, breath fogging the glass. She wore her favorite red dress under a coat that was slightly too small, outgrown but irreplaceable because it had been her mother's choice. Bought 3 weeks before cancer took her and left Marcus to navigate parenthood alone. Is it far, Daddy? About an hour, maybe more if the roads are bad. Will there be a princess? Marcus smiled despite everything. She asked this about every new place, every situation, filtered through the lens of fairy tales and hoped that adults learned to abandon, but children somehow kept alive. I don't think so, baby. Just an old house that used to belong to family. Then why are we going? Because I need to see it with my own eyes. Because Ranger knows something's wrong, and I trust that dog more than I trust any lawyer. Because your mother made me promise to fight for you no matter what it cost, and walking away feels like breaking that promise. Because sometimes you have to see what you're giving up before you can let it go. The drive took 90 minutes. The road was worse than Marcus remembered, pitted with potholes that winter had cracked open like wounds. Snow lined the shoulders, gray and old, stubborn in the way of mountain weather that refused to acknowledge spring existed. The higher they climbed, the quieter Sophie became, her natural exuberance dimming as the forest closed in and the temperature dropped despite the truck's struggling heater. Ranger never took his eyes off the tree line, never relaxed. The tension in the dog's body communicated what words couldn't. They were entering territory someone else had claimed, marked, made dangerous. The gate appeared first. Iron bars 12 feet high, topped with spikes that looked ornamental until you got close enough to see how sharp they were. The gate hung open, one hinge broken, but Marcus could see where it had been recently disturbed. Fresh scratches in the rust, boot prints in the mud where someone had stepped off the gravel drive. He stopped the truck, engine idling, studying the ground. Military training had taught him to read disturbance patterns to see what civilians missed. These prints were recent, maybe 24 hours old, size 11 boots, probably Danner or similar tactical footwear. Heavy tread, deep impression. Someone carrying weight, possibly equipment. More than one set of prints, overlapping, coming and going multiple times. Bryce had said the property was under surveillance. These tracks said something different, said occupation. Marcus drove through the gate slowly, watching Ranger's reaction. The dog had moved from alert to combat-ready, body coiled, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Whatever scent he'd caught on the wind, it triggered every trained instinct to guard and protect. The house emerged from the forest like a monument to endurance. 3 stories of hand-cut stone, stacked and mortared with the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. Steep slate roof, dark as storm clouds. Windows narrow and deep-set, designed more for defense than light. Chimneys rose at each corner like watchtowers. Ivy climbed the eastern wall, brown and dead from frost, but still clinging with the tenacity of something that refused to let go even in death. Marcus cut the engine. The silence that followed was absolute and wrong. No birds, no wind through the trees, no ambient sound of forest life. Just stillness, so complete it felt like pressure. Sophie unbuckled her seatbelt, staring up at the house through the windshield. It's not a castle. No, it's a fortress. What's the difference? Marcus reached back to rest his hand on Ranger's head, grounding himself through the contact. Castles are where princes live. Fortresses are where soldiers make their stand. He got out, every sense heightened, cataloging details. Tire tracks in the gravel, fresh enough that water still pooled in the depressions. Chemical smell on the air, faint but distinct. Oil and solvent, the signature of weapons that had been recently cleaned and maintained. Ranger's training had specialized in explosives, but Marcus had learned to identify the markers of military presence, and this place reeked of it. Someone had been here, not to guard, to search. Sophie climbed out of the truck, her small hand finding his immediately. She was shivering, though whether from cold or instinct Marcus couldn't tell. He picked her up, settling her weight on his hip, and walked toward the front entrance. Ranger flanked them, moving in tactical patterns that were automatic after years of partnership. The front door was massive oak, iron-banded, with a lock that looked older than Marcus's grandfather. He pulled out the keys Bryce had included in the folder, but before he could use them, Ranger broke position and moved to the edge of the stone porch. The dog's nose worked the ground, then the wall, then the air. A low whine built in his chest, pitched too high for most humans to hear comfortably. Marcus set Sophie down, telling her to stay put, and joined the dog. Ranger was focused on a specific section of the exterior wall where the foundation met the porch. Marcus knelt, running his hand over the rough stone. Cold, solid, unremarkable. But when he leaned closer, he caught what Ranger had already identified. The chemical scent was stronger here, concentrated. Not just oil, cosmoline, the military-grade preservative used for long-term weapons storage, mixed with something else, gunpowder residue, recent enough to still be volatile. Someone had stood here with a rifle, rested the barrel against the stone, probably watching the road, waiting. Marcus stood, scanning the tree line with new understanding. The surveillance Bryce mentioned wasn't cameras. It was human, active, possibly still ongoing. The tracks, the weapon residue, the absolute silence. This wasn't an empty house waiting for an heir. This was a site under active watch, and whoever was watching didn't want to be seen. The lock turned easily, too easily for something that hadn't been used in 2 years. Recently oiled, recently tested. Marcus pushed the door open and immediately regretted it. The interior was colder than outside. Not the natural cold of an unheated space, but the aggressive cold of stone that had absorbed winter and held it like a grudge. The entrance hall stretched 30 feet to a staircase that vanished into shadows. Dust covered everything in a uniform gray film, except where it didn't. Scuff marks in the dust, footprints partially swept away, signs of recent passage that someone had tried and failed to completely erase. Sophie clutched his leg, her voice small and uncertain. "Daddy, why is it so dark?" Marcus found the light switch by memory, flipped it. Nothing. Either the power was shut off or the bulbs were dead. He pulled out his phone using the flashlight function to illuminate the space. The beam caught on cobwebs thick as curtains, on furniture draped in white sheets that looked like bodies, on portraits lining the walls, stern faces from another century, watching with eyes that seemed to follow movement. Ranger moved ahead, clearing rooms the way he'd been trained. Library to the left, empty. Dining room to the right, chairs pushed away from the table, as if someone had just stood up. Living room straight ahead, dominated by a fireplace large enough to stand inside. The hearth was full of ash, cold and gray, mounded like a cairn. Marcus approached the fireplace, Sophie still pressed against his side. The ash pile was thick enough to represent years of fires, decades maybe. But when he knelt and sifted through it with a poker he found leaning against the mantel, he discovered something underneath. Impressions in the settled ash, clear and recent. Someone had dug here, searched the hearth, moved the ash aside, then tried to redistribute it to hide the disturbance. "Can we go home now?" Sophie's voice carried the quaver of real fear, and Marcus couldn't blame her. This place felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with abandonment and everything to do with violation. Someone wanted something here badly enough to break in, search, and try to cover their tracks. The legal complexity Bryce mentioned probably had nothing to do with taxes and everything to do with whatever was hidden in this house. "Soon, baby, I just need to check something first." He moved to the mantel, running his hand along the wooden surface. Dust coated his palm, but beneath it he felt carved details. Scrollwork, decorative notches, and there, a section that moved slightly when pressure was applied. He pressed harder. Something clicked, mechanical and deliberate. A panel in the wall beside the fireplace swung open, revealing a space no bigger than a shoebox. Inside sat a tin box, rusted at the edges but intact. Marcus lifted it out carefully, feeling the weight, hearing something shift inside. Ranger's bark exploded through the silence. Not the warning bark he used for strangers. The attack bark that meant active threat, immediate danger, no time for assessment. The dog had moved to the entrance hall, body rigid, focused on something outside. Marcus shoved the tin box in his jacket pocket and grabbed Sophie, moving fast toward the back of the house. If Ranger said run, you ran. Questions came later, survival came first. The kitchen was through a narrow hallway, stone-floored and smelling of rot. Marcus could see why. The ceiling sagged, water damaged and swollen, ready to collapse under its own weight. He skirted the worst of it, heading for the back door he remembered from childhood visits. Behind him, he heard the front door open, heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving with the careful precision of people who knew how to be quiet. He reached for the back door handle just as the floor beneath him gave way. The sensation was pure vertigo. 1 second he was standing on solid ground. The next he was falling through space with Sophie's scream cutting the air and Ranger's barking growing distant. Marcus twisted, trying to shield Sophie with his body, trying to control the fall. But momentum had its own ideas. They hit bottom hard, not ground but debris, splintered wood, broken tile, chunks of rotten plaster that exploded into dust on impact. Marcus's shoulder took the worst of it, joint compressing in a way that promised pain later, but at least prevented Sophie from hitting anything solid. She was crying, terrified, but uninjured, and that was all that mattered. Above them, the hole gaped like a wound. Marcus could see the kitchen floor's jagged edge, see Ranger's face appear at the opening, nose working frantically to assess whether his pack was injured. Beyond that, Marcus heard voices, men calling to each other, coordinating search patterns, using terminology that confirmed what the boot prints and weapon residue had suggested. These weren't security guards. They were operators, military contractors, or worse. Marcus forced himself to inventory their situation. They'd fallen maybe 10 feet into what should have been a crawl space, but was clearly something more intentional. The space was taller than normal, maybe 6 feet of clearance, concrete floor, poured and level. Support beams that looked deliberate rather than structural necessity, and scattered through the debris from the collapsed floor, reflecting Marcus's phone light in a way that made his breath stop. Gold. Not dust, not reflection. Actual gold bars approximately 14 inches long and 3 inches square, stamped with text Marcus could barely make out through the dirt, but which his mind filled in automatically. U.S. Treasury, 400 Troy Oz, 1943. His hand closed around the nearest bar, lifting it, feeling the impossible weight. Gold was dense in a way few people understood until they held it. This single bar weighed close to 28 pounds, and if genuine, was worth approximately $800,000 at current market rates. There were 12 bars visible in the debris. 12, nearly $10 million just sitting in the crawl space under a rotting kitchen floor in a house his great-aunt had allegedly lived in poverty. Sophie's sobs had quieted to hiccups. She was staring at the gold with the simple fascination of a child who didn't understand value, only saw something shiny and new. "Is it treasure, Daddy?" The voices above grew louder. Someone had found the hole. Marcus heard equipment sounds, tactical gears shifting, radios crackling with encrypted chatter. They'd be down here in minutes, maybe seconds, if they had rappelling gear in their vehicles. Marcus pulled Sophie close, thinking fast. The crawl space extended beyond the immediate debris field. He could see it continuing under the rest of the house, maybe leading to an access point. But moving meant leaving the gold, and something about that felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. His great-aunt had lived poor, had died in a care facility, had refused to sell this house despite having literal millions hidden beneath the floorboards. Why? The tin box pressed against his ribs through the jacket fabric. Marcus pulled it out, hands shaking slightly, and pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, a small journal, leather-bound and swollen with moisture damage. A Zippo lighter tarnished but engraved with initials, VT 1968, and a letter sealed in wax addressed in elegant script to the custodian. Marcus broke the seal. The letter inside was handwritten, the ink faded but legible, dated 3 months ago. "To my successor, if you are reading this, the burden has passed to you. For 80 years I have watched paint peel and winters come. For 80 years I have worn threadbare coats and eaten simple meals, while the town whispered that the Thorne fortune was lost, that I was mad, that I had wasted my inheritance on nothing. Let them whisper. Their pity was my shield. What lies beneath this house does not belong to us. It does not belong to the Thornes or the Hayes. It is the lifeblood of a nation, entrusted to us in the darkest hour of the last war, held in secret so that if the worst happened, if Washington fell, if the armies broke, the heart of America would still beat. I swore an oath in 1943, not to a king, not to a general, but to the future. I kept that oath. I lived poor so the nation could stay rich. I accepted cold so the fire of sovereignty would never die. The wolves are always at the door. Trust no one who seeks the gold for themselves. You are the gatekeeper now. Honor demands sacrifice. Duty demands silence. This is not a gift. This is a sentence. Protect what I protected. Die as I died. Poor in pocket, rich in purpose. Vivian Thorne. The words hit Marcus like hammer blows. His great-aunt hadn't been crazy. She'd been a soldier, same as him. Only her battlefield had been this house, and her enemy had been time and temptation, and anyone who tried to take what she'd sworn to guard. Above, someone lowered rope through the hole. Boots appeared, tactical pants, the visual signature of men who'd done this before and expected no resistance. Marcus looked at the gold bar in his hand, looked at Sophie, whose face was still wet with tears, whose heart was failing day by day, whose life could be saved by a single one of these bars and no one would ever know. Ranger barked again, urgent and desperate. The dog was telling him to run, to escape, to survive. But Vivian's letter burned in Marcus's mind. Honor demands sacrifice. This is not a gift. This is a sentence. Sophie's small hand touched the gold, then touched Marcus's face. Can you sell it to fix my heart? The question destroyed something in Marcus's chest. Of course he could. Of course he should. What good was duty to a dead nation if his daughter died because he was too principled to take what she needed? What kind of father chose abstract honor over his child's life? But Ranger was watching him. The dog's eyes held no judgment, only steadiness, only the reminder that they were pack and pack protected each other, but also protected what mattered, what was right, what was bigger than survival. Marcus set the gold bar down. Carefully, deliberately, he set it down and picked up his daughter instead. No, baby, this isn't ours to sell. He didn't know if he was making the right choice. Didn't know if he could live with it. Didn't know if years from now he'd look back at this moment and see it as the decision that killed his daughter, because he'd valued principle over life. But he knew Vivian Thorne had made the same choice every day for 80 years. Knew she'd died in poverty when wealth was literally under her feet. Knew she'd trusted him to understand what she'd been too isolated and too burdened to explain to anyone else. The rope hit the ground. Boots touched debris. A flashlight beam swept the space, found Marcus, found Sophie, found the gold. A voice, amplified and authoritative, echoed through the crawlspace. Marcus Hayes, step away from the property. This is a restricted site. You are trespassing. Marcus didn't move, couldn't move, because he just understood something that changed everything. If this was a restricted site, if these were official agents, they would have identified themselves properly. They would have shown warrants, followed protocol, acted within the law. They were doing none of those things, which meant Vivian's wolves had finally come to the door, and they'd brought guns. Ma'am. Part 1, complete word count, 4,087 words. Target, 6,500. Continuing to reach minimum word count. Ranger appeared at the edge of the hole, his bark modulating into something between a warning and question. The dog could reach Marcus if he jumped, but the fall was too far, too dangerous, and Marcus couldn't risk both of them trapped down here. The flashlight beam stayed fixed on Marcus's face, deliberate and blinding. The man attached to it descended the rope with practiced efficiency, boots hitting ground in a crouch that spoke to extensive training. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing civilian clothes over tactical gear. A contractor, Marcus realized. Private security, probably former military, definitely expensive. I'm going to need you to put your hands where I can see them and move away from the artifacts. Marcus shifted Sophie so she was behind him, his body a wall between her and the light. The gold bars lay scattered in the debris field, impossible to miss, impossible to explain away. The artifacts. Is that what you're calling them? Because my great-aunt's will calls them a family inheritance. And last I checked, family inheritance doesn't require armed security. The man's expression didn't change. Professional detachment, the kind developed by people who'd learned to separate emotion from execution. Your great-aunt was subject to a federal agreement that superseded personal property rights. This site is under government protection until proper protocols can be established. What you're looking at is classified material, Mr. Hayes. Removing it would constitute theft of government property. Funny, my lawyer didn't mention any federal agreements when he told me I'd inherited the place. In fact, he specifically said I owned it outright, debts and all. Your lawyer was not briefed on certain historical contexts that remained sealed until your aunt's death triggered disclosure requirements. Marcus felt the pieces shifting, trying to fit together into something that made sense. Bryce showing up in the middle of the night. The offer to buy the property immediately, no questions asked. The tax lien that appeared out of nowhere after Vivian had lived here for decades without issue. The surveillance that wasn't surveillance but active occupation. Who do you work for? That's not relevant to your current situation. Try again, because if you're federal agents, you have to identify yourselves and show credentials. If you're not federal agents, you're breaking and entering on private property, which makes you criminals. So which is it? The man's jaw tightened. Behind him, two more figures descended the rope. Same tactical gear, same professional bearing, same weapons carried with the casual competence of people who'd used them recently and would use them again without hesitation. Three armed men in a confined space with Marcus unarmed and holding a 4-year-old. The math wasn't complicated. The tactical situation was hopeless. But Marcus had been in hopeless situations before, and he'd learned that sometimes the only way out was through. Sophie, I need you to climb on my back. Hold on tight, okay? She didn't question him, didn't hesitate, just wrapped her small arms around his neck and locked her legs around his waist, trusting him completely because she was 4 and he was her father, and in her world that equation still balanced. Marcus moved, not toward the men, but laterally into the darker section of the crawl space where the debris field gave way to open area. The ground sloped slightly, suggesting a deliberate grade, drainage towards something. He followed the slope, moving fast, ignoring the shouts behind him. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Marcus spun, muscle memory taking over, training overriding thought. He drove his elbow back into soft tissue, heard the whoosh of expelled air, felt the grip release. Then he was running, bent low under the ceiling, Sophie's weight barely registering against the surge of adrenaline that turned fear into fuel. The crawl space opened into something larger. Not a room exactly, but a chamber carved into bedrock, roughly circular, maybe 15 feet across. The walls were stone, natural rather than constructed. The floor was concrete, poured to create a level surface. And in the center, embedded in that concrete, was a hatch, steel, circular, with a wheel lock like something from a submarine. Marcus didn't stop to think, didn't evaluate, just grabbed the wheel and pulled. The mechanism resisted, seized by rust or time or both, but he hauled on it with everything he had, desperation translating to strength. The wheel moved, grudgingly, grinding metal on metal, but it moved. Behind him, flashlight beams swept the chamber. Voices shouted coordinates, directions, orders that meant reinforcements were coming and options were shrinking. The hatch opened. Below was darkness absolute and a smell that made Marcus's throat close, the scent of metal and stone and air that hadn't moved in decades. A ladder descended into nothing, rungs slick with condensation or worse. He had maybe 3 seconds to decide. Stay and get captured. Explain to armed men why he'd found millions in gold and tried to run. Hand Sophie over to whatever bureaucratic process these contractors represented and hope the system protected them instead of swallowing them. Or go down, into the unknown, into whatever Vivian had protected for 80 years, whatever was important enough to live poor for, to die for, to burden a stranger with. Ranger's bark echoed from above, frantic now. The dog had found the hole leading down to the chamber, was trying to reach Marcus, was offering the only help he could, warning that time was gone and choice was mandatory. Marcus stepped onto the ladder. Sophie clung to him, silent now, understanding on some primal level that silence meant safety. He descended fast, hand over hand, boots finding rungs more by feel than sight. 5 rungs, 10. The darkness swallowed them completely. Above, flashlight beams illuminated the hatch opening. Someone shouted, "He's going down. Repeat, target is descending into subsurface level." Marcus reached the bottom. His boots hit solid ground. He swung the ladder, dislodging it from its mooring, heard it clatter against stone as it fell. Then he slammed his hand against what he hoped was a closing mechanism for the hatch. Hydraulics engaged. Old, protesting, but functional. The hatch swung shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. Locking mechanisms engaged automatically, heavy bolts sliding into place with sounds that promised those mechanisms would not be easily reversed. Darkness, complete and total. The kind of dark that existed underground, away from any source of natural light. Marcus fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, Sophie's breathing fast and frightened against his neck. The phone's screen lit, casting weak light that barely touched the edges of what surrounded them. They were in a tunnel, Not natural, but constructed. Concrete walls, rounded ceiling, maybe 8 feet in diameter. Industrial looking, purpose-built. And running along the ceiling, protected by metal conduits, were cables, thick, insulated, carrying power or data or both to somewhere the builders had wanted to remain connected even underground. Marcus started walking, not because he had a plan, not because he knew where the tunnel led, but because staying still meant the men above would eventually find another way down, and moving meant at least he was trying, at least he was fighting, at least he wasn't giving up the way Bryce had suggested Vivian had given up. Except Vivian hadn't given up. She'd held the line for 8 decades, and now Marcus understood why. Because whatever was down here, whatever this tunnel led to, it was worth protecting, worth living poor for, worth dying for, worth inheriting. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, and Marcus Hayes, former soldier, current father, accidental heir to a burden he didn't understand, carried his daughter into the unknown and hoped, desperately, irrationally hoped, that he was making the right choice. Behind them, muffled by steel and stone, Rangers' barking faded to nothing. The tunnel extended 200 yards before terminating at another steel door. Marcus counted his steps, old habits resurfacing, mapping the distance in his mind even as Sophie's weight grew heavier and his shoulder throbbed where it had absorbed their fall. The door bore no markings, no warnings, just a keypad mounted at chest height with numbers worn smooth by decades of use. He tried the handle first. Locked, as expected. The keypad glowed faintly when he touched it, some internal battery still holding charge after all these years. Marcus pulled out Vivian's letter again, searching for numbers, dates, anything that might serve as a code. Born 1928, died 2025, the house built in 1880, Operation Ironclad mentioned 1943. Try Grandma's birthday, Daddy. Sophie's voice was small, exhausted, but the suggestion made Marcus pause. He didn't know Vivian's birthday, didn't know her at all, really, beyond childhood memories and a letter written in desperation. But Sophie was 4 and believed in the logic of grandmas and birthdays. And sometimes children saw connections adults had forgotten to consider. He tried the numbers from the Zippo's engraving instead. 1968. The keypad beeped negative. Then he tried reversing them. 8691. Another negative. He had maybe 3 more attempts before the system locked him out permanently. Before whatever security protocols governed this place decided he was an intruder rather than an heir. The journal. Marcus pulled it from his jacket, pages swollen with moisture, ink running in places where water had breached the oilcloth wrapping. He flipped through carefully, looking for numbers that stood out, for patterns in Vivian's handwriting that might indicate significance. Most entries were coded, gibberish phrases that meant nothing without a cipher key. But near the back, in different ink, fresher than the rest, he found a sequence written in the margin. 114443. October 14th, 1943. The date appeared multiple times in Vivian's letter. The shipment is secure, she'd written. Ironclad is active. Marcus entered the numbers. The keypad beeped acceptance. Locks disengaged with mechanical precision. The door swung open on hinges that moved silently despite the years, revealing stairs descending into depths the flashlight couldn't penetrate. He felt Sophie shaking against his back, not from cold this time, but from the accumulated terror of falling through floors and running from armed men and descending into places that smelled like tombs. I'm scared, Daddy. Me too, baby. But sometimes we have to walk through scary places to get to safety. Can you be brave a little longer? Her nod was more tremble than affirmation, but she held on, and that was enough. The stairs went down 43 steps. Marcus counted each one, noting how the temperature dropped as they descended, how the air changed from stale to processed, how the walls transitioned from rough concrete to smooth stone to something that looked almost polished. At the bottom, another door, this one unlocked, swinging open at his touch to reveal something impossible. A room. Not a bunker or a vault or a makeshift hiding place, but an actual room, furnished and maintained. Concrete floor covered with industrial carpet still intact. Metal shelves lining 3 walls, packed with wooden crates stenciled with military designations. A desk in one corner, the surface clear except for a telephone. Rotary style, beige plastic, connected to nothing Marcus could see. And in the center, mounted on the wall like an altarpiece, a bronze plaque bearing an eagle seal and text that made Marcus's breath catch. United States War Department Office of Strategic Services Strategic Reserve Allocation Facility Site Baker, established 1942, authorized personnel only, the OSS, predecessor to the CIA. Dissolved in 1945, operations transferred or buried, records sealed for national security. Except this one hadn't been buried. This one had been maintained, guarded, kept alive through 8 decades of secrecy while the world above forgot it existed. Marcus set Sophie down, keeping her close, and approached the shelves. The crates were uniform, approximately 18 inches square, stamped with lot numbers and weight specifications. He pried the lid off the nearest one, nails giving way with rusty protest. Gold bars, stacked in precise rows, each one identical to those scattered in the crawlspace above. 50 bars per crate, Marcus calculated. 25 crates visible on just this wall. That was 1,250 bars, minimum. At 800,000 each, roughly $1 billion on this single wall. He moved to the next wall. More crates, different stamps. These bore the mark of the U.S. Mint, Philadelphia, dated 1943 to 1944. He opened one. More gold, but these were coins rather than bars. Eagles, double eagles, denominations that hadn't been minted in 80 years. Collector's items worth far more than their gold content. The third wall held documents, crates of papers, files, records sealed in waterproof containers. Marcus opened one at random, pulling out a folder marked classified, magic clearance required. Inside were photographs, surveillance reports, maps of European cities with annotations in German and English. Intelligence materials, the kind that governments killed to protect or expose. Sophie tugged at his jacket, pointing to something he'd missed. A small door set low in the wall, almost hidden behind the desk. Child height, child accessible. She walked to it, fearless in the way children were when adults had already determined a space was safe, and pushed it open. Another tunnel, narrower, rougher, sloping upward. Not part of the original construction, but added later, carved through stone with tools Marcus could see abandoned near the entrance. An escape route, he realized. Vivian had built herself a way out, probably spent years digging it, ensuring she'd never be trapped down here the way he was trapped now. "Can we go, Daddy? Please?" He wanted to. Every instinct screamed to grab Sophie and run through that tunnel, follow it wherever it led, escape with their lives, and forget about Bolton, Wiedis, and dead women's burdens. But the contractors above wouldn't forget. They'd find another entrance, breach the facility eventually, and when they did, they'd know Marcus had been here, had seen everything, had become a witness that needed silencing. Unless he had leverage. Unless he had proof, documentation, evidence so damning that eliminating him would cost more than letting him live. Marcus moved to the desk, searching drawers. Most were empty, cleaned out decades ago. But the bottom drawer stuck, swollen with moisture or deliberately jammed. He forced it, wood splintering, and found what Vivian had left for exactly this moment. A strong box, small enough to carry, heavy enough to indicate contents of substance. The box opened with the same code that had unlocked the door. Inside, microfilm reels, dozens of them, labeled with dates and operation names. Overlord, Market Garden, Manhattan. Names that appeared in history books, in declassified documents, in the public record of World War II. Except these versions carried the notation actual, which in intelligence terms meant unedited, unexpurgated, the real story beneath the official narrative. Beneath the microfilm, a ledger. Handwritten entries in Vivian's script, dates running from 1943 to 2024. Not random dates, but a log, a record of every time someone had tried to access Site Baker, tried to claim the gold, tried to break the covenant. Names appeared repeatedly. General Howard Caldwell, 1985. Denied access, removed from command. Senator James Rothmore, 1997. Requested audit, request blocked by executive order. Director Raymond Torch, 2011. Authorized excavation, excavation halted by federal injunction. And the most recent entry, dated 3 months ago, Richard Caldwell, civilian, claims hereditary right to access. Authorization pending legal review. Note, subject is grandson of General H. Caldwell. Exercise extreme caution. Marcus's hands tightened on the ledger. Richard Caldwell, the name from Bryce's paperwork, the buyer willing to pay $200,000 for immediate transfer. Not some random investor, but the grandson of a man who tried to steal this facility 40 years ago, who'd been stopped by Vivian, who'd apparently passed his obsession down through the generations like a curse. The telephone rang. Impossible. The thing wasn't connected to anything, sat on a desk 40 feet underground in a facility sealed since God knew when. But it rang anyway, shrill and insistent, an old-fashioned mechanical bell that couldn't be silenced. Marcus picked it up. Silence on the other end, then breathing. Human breathing, measured and controlled. Mr. Hayes, you've demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness. However, you've also placed yourself in an untenable position. The voice was older than the contractors, refined, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Not military, something else, something worse. Who is this? Someone who's been waiting a very long time for Vivian Thorne to die. You found her little museum. Quite impressive, isn't it? 80 years of accumulated intelligence, preserved like insects in amber. Do you have any idea what those microfilm reels are worth? What certain governments would pay to ensure they never surface? If you're calling to threaten me, you're wasting your time. I'm already underground with armed men hunting me, and no way out. I'm calling to offer you the same voice I offered your aunt repeatedly over the past 4 decades. Walk away, take compensation that will solve all your financial problems. Let professionals handle materials you don't understand. Vivian didn't walk away. Vivian died alone in a care facility, penniless, with no one at her bedside. Is that the legacy you want? The noble guardian who sacrificed everything for a principle no one remembers? Sophie was pulling at his jacket again, urgent, trying to get his attention. Marcus glanced down, saw she was pointing at something on the desk. A photograph half hidden under papers, showing a young woman in military uniform standing beside a man in an army officer's dress blues. The woman was clearly Vivian, maybe 20 years old, fierce and proud. The man looked familiar in a way Marcus couldn't immediately place. My daughter needs surgery. $180,000. You're telling me you'll pay that if I walk away from this? I'll pay double, triple, whatever number makes you comfortable. All I ask in return is that you forget this facility exists. Forget the gold, forget the documents, forget you ever heard the name Ironclad. Marcus studied the photograph, recognition finally clicking. The officer wasn't just similar to someone he knew. The officer was someone he knew, or had been, decades before Marcus was born. The resemblance was unmistakable now that he knew where to look. The officer was his grandfather. Marcus's mother's father, who died when Marcus was 3, who existed only in faded memories and stories his mother told. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, killed in action in Korea, 1951. Except according to every official record, Thomas Hayes had never been involved in anything classified, never been assigned to intelligence operations, never been anywhere near the OSS. The photograph said different. You knew my grandfather. The pause on the other end extended too long. When the voice returned, something had shifted in its tone. Less confident, more wary. I knew of him. He was part of the original team that established Site Baker. Good soldier, followed orders. Understood the mission came first. What happened to him? Korea happened. War happened. He died serving his country, which is more than most can say. Sophie was pulling harder now, trying to drag Marcus toward the tunnel. She'd stopped being quiet, stopped being patient, fear overwhelming training and trust. Daddy, we have to go now. The men are coming. Marcus heard it too. Muffled sounds from above, machinery working, maybe drilling, maybe explosives. The contractors had found another way in or were making one, and the steel door that had bought them time wouldn't hold forever. I need to think about your offer. You have 5 minutes. After that, my patience expires and the men upstairs receive different orders, orders that account for witnesses and loose ends. The line went dead. Marcus stood holding the receiver, mind racing, trying to calculate odds that kept coming up negative. He could take the microfilm, the ledger, run through Vivian's tunnel and pray it didn't collapse or dead end. But that left Sophie exposed during the escape, left them fugitives with evidence no one would believe, and hunters who'd never stop looking. Or he could do what the voice suggested. Take the money, save Sophie, let the facility and its secrets become someone else's problem. Walk away the way any sane person would, the way any father who prioritized his child over abstract principles should. Except the photograph on the desk showed Thomas Hayes, who'd helped build this place, who'd believed it was worth protecting. And next to him stood Vivian Thorne, who'd spent 80 years proving him right. Two people Marcus had never really known, connected by a mission they'd valued more than comfort or safety or the approval of people who'd never understand why they'd made the choices they made. Honor demands sacrifice, Vivian had written. This is not a gift. This is a sentence. Marcus packed the microfilm into the strongbox, added the ledger, grabbed the photograph. Then he took Sophie's hand and moved toward the escape tunnel, not running away, not giving up, but retreating to regroup, to plan, to figure out how to fight enemies who had more money, more weapons, more everything than one broke veteran with a sick daughter and a dead woman's legacy. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, somewhere we can think. The tunnel was exactly what it appeared to be. Rough, unfinished, carved by hand over years of patient labor. Support beams propped up the ceiling at irregular intervals, some rotting, some replaced more recently. Vivian's work, Marcus realized. She'd spent decades preparing for the possibility that she'd need to evacuate, to escape, to survive another day of standing watch. The tunnel climbed steadily, sloping upward through bedrock that gradually transitioned to soil. Tree roots penetrated the ceiling, drinking moisture that dripped constantly, making the floor slick and treacherous. Marcus carried Sophie again, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, focusing on footing and breathing and the slowly growing circle of daylight ahead. They emerged in the forest maybe half a mile from the house, hidden behind a screen of laurel bushes that had grown wild over the exit. Marcus paused, listening, scanning for threats. The woods were quiet except for wind and birds, normal sounds that suggested they'd emerged far enough from the contractor's perimeter to avoid immediate detection. His truck was parked at the house. Ranger was still up there, probably frantic, possibly injured if the contractors had used force to bypass him. Going back meant walking into a trap. Not going back meant abandoning the dog, which wasn't an option Marcus could live with. Sophie solved the problem by collapsing. Not dramatically, no warning, just her legs giving out, body going limp in Marcus's arms, breath stopping in a way that sent pure terror through his nervous system. He laid her on the ground, checking her pulse, her airways, seeing her lips turning blue, seeing the cyanosis that meant her heart was failing right now. In the woods, with no hospital within 30 minutes and no way to call for help. CPR. He'd been trained, had practiced on dummies, but Sophie wasn't a dummy, and his hands shook as he positioned them on her tiny chest, calculating how much pressure her ribs could take without breaking. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 more compressions, 2 more breaths. Her heart caught, stuttered, beat once, twice, established a rhythm that was too fast but at least present. She sucked in air, coughing, crying, her small body convulsing with the effort of pulling oxygen into blood that couldn't carry enough. Marcus held her, rocking slightly, aware that this was just a preview. That without surgery, these episodes would come more frequently, last longer, until one day her heart wouldn't restart and all the CPR in the world wouldn't matter. The voice on the phone had offered enough money to fix this, enough money to save her. All Marcus had to do was forget, walk away, let professionals handle things. It was the rational choice, the choice any good father would make. But Thomas Hayes had been a good father, presumably, and he'd still helped build Site Baker, had still believed some things were worth protecting, even at cost to family, to personal comfort, to the easy life. And Vivian had doubled down on that belief, had lived it so completely that she died alone rather than compromise. What did they know that Marcus didn't? What had they seen in 1943 that made them willing to accept burdens most people would refuse? He thought about the gold, thought about $5 billion sitting underground while the country struggled with debt and infrastructure and all the problems money could theoretically solve. Thought about how easy it would be to justify taking it, using it, spending it on things that seemed more important than keeping promises to the dead. Except the gold wasn't really the point. The microfilm was the point. The intelligence records, the photographs, the evidence of things that had happened and been covered up and buried so deep that even people who'd been there had started to doubt their memories. That was what Vivian had protected. That was what the voice on the phone wanted destroyed. Not the gold, but the truth. And the truth was apparently dangerous enough that people would kill to keep it hidden. Sophie's breathing had stabilized. Not good, but better. Marcus picked her up, cradling her carefully, and started walking. Not toward the house, but away, deeper into the forest, following terrain features he remembered from training exercises, from orienteering courses, from the accumulated knowledge of how to move through hostile territory when the enemy held every advantage except knowledge of the ground. He walked for an hour. Sophie drifted in and out of consciousness, her weight growing heavier as exhaustion defeated adrenaline. Marcus's shoulder had progressed from throbbing to screaming, joint probably partially separated, ligaments damaged in ways that would require medical attention he couldn't afford even before inheriting a facility full of gold he couldn't use. The tree line broke near a road, not the main highway but a Forest Service route, barely maintained, used mostly by hunters and rangers. Marcus waited, watching until he saw what he needed. An old pickup truck approaching slowly, driven by someone who looked local, who looked like the kind of person who'd stop for a man carrying an injured child. Marcus stepped into the road. The truck stopped. An elderly man leaned out the window, weathered face creasing with concern. "You folks all right? That girl don't look so good." "She needs a hospital. My truck broke down about 3 miles back, and my phone's dead. Can you give us a ride to town?" The old man hesitated maybe 2 seconds before nodding. Mountain people helped each other. It was culture, tradition, the unwritten law that governed communities where help wasn't something you waited for, but something you provided. "Get in the back. I'll take you to County General. 20 minutes. Marcus climbed into the truck bed, settling Sophie against him, strongbox hidden in his jacket. The truck pulled away, engine laboring, transmission grinding, but moving, covering distance, putting miles between them and the facility and the contractors who by now had probably breached the vault and discovered their targets had escaped. Sophie opened her eyes, clarity returning briefly. "Is Ranger okay?" "I don't know, baby. I hope so. We have to go back for him." "I will, I promise. But first we need to make sure you are safe." The hospital appeared through the trees. Small, rural, the kind of facility that served mountain communities and probably had more experience with logging accidents than pediatric cardiac emergencies. But they'd have oxygen, monitoring equipment, maybe enough expertise to stabilize Sophie until she could be transferred somewhere with actual specialists. The old man pulled up to the emergency entrance. Marcus thanked him, grabbed Sophie in the strongbox, pushed through automatic doors into fluorescent brightness that felt aggressive after the forest shadows. A nurse looked up from her station, saw Sophie's blue lips, and immediately triggered whatever protocol governed critical pediatric cases. Within minutes, Sophie was on a gurney, oxygen mask secured, monitors beeping, nurses and a doctor working with the efficient urgency of people who'd done this before but never got comfortable with children struggling to breathe. The doctor looked at Marcus, seeing past the dirt and exhaustion to the terror underneath. "She's in heart failure. We need to know her medical history. What medications, what congenital conditions, what we're dealing with." Marcus recited the information mechanically. Tetralogy of Fallot, they called it. 4 defects in one heart, fixable with surgery, fatal without. She'd been on the waiting list for transplant evaluation when her mother died, but then insurance changed and doctors changed, and somehow Sophie had fallen through the cracks in the system, becoming a problem deferred until the problem became a crisis. "We can stabilize her, but she needs surgery soon. Days, not weeks. Do you have insurance?" No, the doctor's expression didn't change. To his credit, he didn't lecture, didn't judge, just nodded and turned back to Sophie. Medical ethics said treat first, worry about payment later. Reality said the bills would come eventually, and Marcus had no way to pay them. Unless he did. Unless he took the phone call's offer, collected enough money to save his daughter, and let someone else worry about 80-year-old secrets that probably didn't matter anymore anyway. A television mounted in the corner was playing news. Local station, coverage of county business, the usual mix of development proposals and budget discussions. Then the anchor pivoted to a news story. County commissioners voted today to approve expedited review of a development proposal by Caldwell Holdings. The project would restore historic properties in Summit County, including the recently inherited Iron Gate Manor. Commission Chairman Richard Caldwell recused himself from the vote, but spoke in favor of preservation efforts. The screen showed a man in his early 50s, silver hair, expensive suit, speaking with the practiced ease of someone comfortable with cameras and authority. Richard Caldwell, looking exactly like what he was, successful, respectable, the kind of citizen who chaired commissions and funded scholarships and got invited to speak at civic functions. Not the kind of person who'd hire contractors to hunt down veterans and children. Not the kind of person who'd threaten and manipulate and lie to claim something that wasn't his. Except his grandfather had been exactly that kind of person, according to Vivian's ledger. And family traits ran deep, especially traits like greed and ambition and the belief that rules applied to other people. Marcus watched Caldwell smile at the camera, watched him shake hands with commissioners, watched him embody respectability and civic pride. Then he thought about the voice on the phone, measured and refined and absolutely certain that Marcus would take the money and forget. They were right, probably. Most people would. Most people should. The smart play, the survival play, was to accept reality and move on. But Marcus wasn't most people. He was Thomas Hayes's grandson and Vivian Thorne's heir, and a soldier who'd learned that some positions couldn't be abandoned just because holding them was hard. He pulled out Vivian's letter, reading it again. The wolves are always at the door. Trust no one who seeks the gold for themselves. Richard Caldwell sought the gold. Sought it enough to inherit his grandfather's obsession, to wait decades for Vivian to die, to orchestrate legal traps and financial pressure and violence against anyone who stood in his way. Which meant Caldwell was exactly the person Vivian had warned against. Exactly the threat she'd spent her life preparing for. Sophie was stable now, monitors showing normal sinus rhythm, oxygen saturation creeping back towards acceptable levels. The doctor emerged from the treatment room, stripping off gloves. She's sleeping. We've given her medication that should keep her stable for a few hours, but I can't stress enough that this is temporary. She needs definitive treatment soon, or the next episode will kill her. I understand. Can I see her? The doctor hesitated, studying Marcus with the clinical assessment medical professionals developed, seeing the dirt, the exhaustion, the barely controlled desperation. 5 minutes, then you should get some rest yourself. You look like you've been through hell. Marcus managed something that might have been a smile. Hell was watching your daughter's lips turn blue. Hell was knowing you could save her by betraying everything your family had stood for. Hell was understanding that whatever choice you made, people would get hurt, and some of those people would be the ones you loved most. He sat beside Sophie's bed, watching monitors translate her heartbeat into electronic proof of life. She looked small against hospital white, vulnerable in ways that made Marcus's chest physically ache. 4 years old and already fighting battles that would break most adults. The strong box sat heavy in his lap. Inside were answers to questions historians had been asking for 80 years. Evidence of operations, decisions, cover-ups that had shaped the world Marcus lived in. Truth that powerful people wanted to stay buried. Vivian had protected this truth, had valued it more than comfort, more than wealth, more than the approval of a society that called her crazy for living poor when riches waited underground. She'd made that choice every day for 80 years, and Marcus was expected to unmake it in 5 minutes because his daughter needed surgery. He thought about Thomas Hayes standing beside Vivian in that photograph. Thought about the choice his grandfather had made to help build Site Baker, knowing it would mean secrets kept from family, knowing it would mean carrying burdens others wouldn't understand. Thomas had been a father too, presumably. Had balanced duty against family the same way Marcus was balancing it now. What had Thomas chosen? What had Vivian chosen? And more importantly, what did they know that made those choices feel necessary rather than insane? Marcus pulled out the microfilm reels, holding them up to the light. Tiny photographs, thousands of pages condensed onto rolls of film that could fit in a pocket. He couldn't read them here, couldn't even verify what they contained. But the labels suggested their contents were explosive enough to justify 80 years of security. Overlord Actual probably meant the real story of D-Day. Manhattan. Actual probably meant the real story of the atomic bomb. Magic Actual probably meant the real story of intelligence operations that history books described in sanitized terms. If these were genuine, if they contradicted official narratives, if they exposed secrets powerful people wanted kept, then releasing them would make Marcus a target not just for Caldwell, but for everyone who'd built careers on maintaining those secrets. But it would also make him impossible to kill quietly, would make the story too big to bury, would turn the choice between truth and silence into a public debate instead of a private murder. Unless he was wrong, unless the reels were blank or useless or exactly what official records claimed. Unless Vivian had been protecting nothing, guarding emptiness, dying poor for a delusion. Marcus needed to know, needed to verify what he had before deciding whether it was worth the cost. The hospital had a business center, a small room with a computer for patients to check email or print documents. Marcus left Sophie sleeping under a nurse's watch and found the room empty. The computer was old, running outdated software, but it had a microfilm reader attachment gathering dust in a drawer. He loaded the first reel. Overlord Actual. Waited while the machine calibrated, while ancient mechanics translated film to screen. Images appeared, photographs of beaches, troops, ships. The invasion of Normandy, documented in real time by military photographers who'd probably died with cameras in hand. Marcus scrolled through, seeing nothing unexpected, until he reached documents rather than photographs. Casualty reports. Not the official numbers taught in schools, but the actual counts, broken down by unit, by hour, by cause of death. The numbers were higher than Marcus had learned, significantly higher. Thousands of men who died on D-Day existed in these records, but apparently not in public history. He kept scrolling, found planning documents, communications between Eisenhower and Roosevelt, strategy discussions that revealed just how close Overlord had come to failing. How many contingencies had been planned for disaster? How many backup operations had waited in case the beaches couldn't be taken? One document, dated June 5, 1944, stopped Marcus cold. A message from Eisenhower to Roosevelt, marked eyes only, discussing what to do if Overlord failed and Hitler gained access to Allied invasion plans. The recommendation was stark. Evacuate gold reserves from Fort Knox to secure locations prepared by OSS. Estimated timeline for total evacuation, 48 hours. Estimated secure capacity, $6 billion in contemporary value. Site Baker was listed among the secure locations, along with 5 others scattered across the United States, each prepared to hold approximately $1 billion in gold reserves if the worst happened. Marcus sat back, understanding finally why Vivian had lived poor, understanding why Thomas Hayes had helped build this place, understanding why secrecy had mattered enough to justify 80 years of isolation. Site Baker wasn't just a vault. It was a contingency plan for the collapse of civilization, a way to ensure that if America lost the war, if Washington fell, if everything went wrong, there would still be resources to rebuild, still be hope, still be a future. That was what Vivian had protected. Not gold, but possibility. Not wealth, but survival. Not money, but the promise that no matter how dark things got, someone had planned for the darkness and prepared a way through, and Richard Caldwell wanted to steal it. Wanted to take that promise and convert it to personal profit, turn national insurance into private fortune, betray the people who'd sacrificed everything to create insurance against apocalypse. Marcus ejected the microfilm, hands steady now, decision made. He would fight Caldwell, would protect the site, would honor the covenant Vivian and Thomas had kept. Not because it was smart or safe or even sane, but because some things were worth protecting, even when protection costed everything. Sophie was still sleeping when he returned. Marcus sat beside her bed, watching her breathe, memorizing the rise and fall of her chest. Whatever happened next, however this ended, at least he'd know he'd tried. At least he'd stood for something. At least he wouldn't die wondering if he could have been braver. The door opened. Not a nurse, but a man Marcus didn't recognize, dressed in the casual anonymity of someone who didn't want to be remembered. He held a phone, extending it toward Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, you have a call." Marcus took the phone, the same refined voice from the facility, patience worn thinner now. "You've had time to think. What's your answer?" Marcus looked at Sophie, looked at the strong box, looked at the future splintering into paths that all led to pain, but at least let him choose which kind. "My answer is no. Whatever you're offering, whatever you're threatening, the answer is no." Silence stretched, then laughter, genuine and surprised. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Mr. Hayes. I genuinely can't tell which. But I respect commitment, even when it's commitment to losing positions. So let me make you a counteroffer. Meet me, face to face, no contractors, no weapons. Let me show you why you're wrong, why Vivian was wrong, why this crusade you've inherited is pointless nostalgia for a war that ended 80 years ago. Where? Tomorrow, noon, the county courthouse. Public, safe, civilized. We'll have a conversation. If I can't convince you to walk away, I'll respect your choice. But at least give me the chance to explain what you're really fighting against." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He sat in the hospital room, holding a phone connected to nothing, understanding that he'd just agreed to walk into a trap, but not seeing any alternative. Caldwell, because the voice had to be Caldwell, had to be the man who'd inherited his grandfather's obsession, had made fighting impossible to refuse. Tomorrow at noon, Marcus would learn whether Vivian's crusade was justified or if he was about to die for nothing. Either way, the waiting was over. The county courthouse stood at the center of Charleston like a monument to optimism nobody felt anymore. Built in 1892, limestone and marble, columns that suggested permanence in a world that had stopped believing institutions lasted. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, scanning approaches, cataloging exits, moving with the automatic wariness of someone who'd survived ambushes by never assuming safety meant what it looked like. Sophie was still hospitalized, stable but fragile, guarded by nurses who'd promised to call if anything changed. The strong box sat in a bus station locker 3 blocks away, key in Marcus's pocket. Insurance that even if this meeting went sideways, he'd still have leverage. Ranger remained missing, location unknown, status uncertain. That absence carved a hole in Marcus's chest that paralleled the one Sophie's illness had opened, 2 voids where certainty used to live. The courthouse lobby smelled like floor wax and institutional neglect. Security consisted of a metal detector staffed by a deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus passed through, setting off no alarms, carrying no weapons because weapons wouldn't help against what he was walking into. This fight wouldn't be won with guns. Second floor, county commission chambers. The directory listed a public meeting at 1 o'clock, which meant the building would be occupied, witnesses present, violence theoretically constrained by the need to maintain appearances. Theoretically. Richard Caldwell waited inside the chamber, standing near the commissioner's bench, examining historical photographs mounted on the walls. He turned when Marcus entered, smile calibrated for warmth without reaching genuine. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would." Up close, Caldwell looked exactly like his voice suggested, polished, expensive, comfortable with authority in ways that came from never questioning whether he deserved it. Mid-50s, silver hair styled with the kind of casual precision that required professional maintenance. Suit that probably cost more than Marcus's truck. Watch that definitely did. "You said you wanted to talk. I'm here. Talk." Caldwell gestured to the chamber seats, invitation implicit. Marcus stayed standing. Small power play, meaningless in the long run, but sometimes the only control available was control over your own body's position in space. "I've spent the last 24 hours researching you, Marcus. May I call you Marcus? I feel we're past formalities given the circumstances. Call me whatever you want. Just get to the point. The point is that you're an interesting man, decorated soldier, Kandahar veteran, saved your friend Daniel Cross's life during an IED incident, received a Bronze Star, though you never mention it, came home, took care of your wife through terminal cancer, now raising your daughter alone while working 3 jobs that barely keep you above water. You're exactly the kind of person this country should be celebrating. Instead, you're broke, exhausted, and watching your child die because the system failed you. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The research was accurate, which meant Caldwell had access to military records, medical files, financial information that should have been private. Meant he had resources Marcus couldn't match, connections Marcus couldn't challenge. You're stalling. I'm establishing context because I want you to understand that I'm not your enemy, Marcus. I'm actually the closest thing to an ally you're going to find in this situation. Caldwell moved to one of the historical photographs, tapping the frame. The image showed the courthouse during construction, men in period clothing standing proud beside unfinished walls, builders, craftsmen, ordinary people creating something designed to outlast them. My grandfather, General Howard Caldwell, believed in legacy, believed that what we build matters less than who benefits from it. He spent 30 years in the Army, serving with distinction, earning the respect of presidents and generals. Then in 1985, he discovered that a woman living alone in a crumbling mansion was sitting on $5 billion in gold reserves that should have been returned to federal custody decades earlier. Vivian was protecting it, fulfilling her mission. Vivian was hoarding it, clinging to a responsibility that had expired the moment World War II ended. The gold should have been transferred back to Fort Knox in 1940. The facility decommissioned, the operation concluded. Instead, she convinced bureaucrats that the threat remained, that contingency planning justified permanent sequestration, that she alone could be trusted to maintain security. Caldwell turned, meeting Marcus's eyes with an intensity that felt rehearsed but no less effective for it. For 40 years, she lived in poverty while guarding wealth that could have rebuilt roads, funded schools, provided health care to people like your daughter. She chose martyrdom over usefulness. My grandfather tried to correct that, tried to convince her that hoarding national resources was the opposite of patriotism, and she destroyed his career for it, accused him of corruption, of theft, of betraying his oath. He died knowing history would remember him as the villain while she played the noble guardian. Marcus thought about Vivian's ledger, about the entry describing General Caldwell's attempt to access Site Baker, thought about how context could change depending on who told the story, how villains always believed they were heroes, and heroes always questioned whether they'd made the right choice. So you're finishing what he started, taking the gold, proving he was right. I'm releasing resources that should never have been locked away. Resources that belong to the American people, not to one woman's paranoid fantasy of duty. And yes, I'll profit from the recovery. I've spent 15 years navigating legal frameworks, establishing legitimate claims, building the infrastructure necessary to properly manage that wealth. Why shouldn't I be compensated for that work? Because compensation and theft were different categories, Marcus wanted to say. Because taking what you hadn't earned was the definition of parasitism, regardless of how many lawyers you hired to make it legal. But arguing ethics with someone who'd rationalized their way to this position wouldn't change anything. What about the microfilm? What about the intelligence records Vivian was protecting? Caldwell's expression shifted, amusement fading into something harder. The microfilm is exactly why this conversation is necessary. Because you've seen what's on those reels. You know they contain information that could destabilize international relationships, compromise ongoing operations, destroy careers of people who acted in good faith based on intelligence that's now outdated. Releasing that material would be irresponsible at best, treasonous at worst. Or it would be the truth, the actual history instead of the sanitized version. History is a narrative we construct to make sense of chaos, Marcus. What happened matters less than what we agree happened. Those microfilm reels contain raw data from a war fought 80 years ago by people who had incomplete information and made decisions under impossible pressure. Judging them now with the clarity of hindsight doesn't serve justice. It serves ego. Your ego, my ego, anyone's ego who wants to feel morally superior to people who actually bore the weight of those choices. The argument was sophisticated, polished by repetition, and probably tested on focus groups. It had the shape of logic without the substance, the appearance of wisdom without requiring actual examination of whether the conclusions followed from the premises. Marcus recognized the technique because he'd heard it before from officers who'd needed to justify questionable orders, from politicians who'd needed to explain why party promises wouldn't be kept. You want me to give you the microfilm? I want you to accept reality. You can't win this fight, Marcus. I have lawyers, resources, connections at every level of state and federal government. I can tie you up in court for decades. I can make sure your daughter's medical needs are never covered by insurance. I can ensure that every job you apply for somehow falls through. Every apartment you try to rent suddenly becomes unavailable. I don't want to do those things, but I will because this matters more than your pride or Vivian's legacy or any individual's sense of righteous martyrdom. The threat was delivered calmly, almost apologetically, which somehow made it worse than if Caldwell had shouted. This was how power worked when wielded by people who believed themselves reasonable, not through violence, but through the systematic removal of options until compliance became the only path to survival. Marcus thought about Sophie in the hospital, thought about the surgery she needed, the life she deserved, the future that depended entirely on decisions Marcus made in the next few minutes. Thought about how easy it would be to surrender, to take whatever deal Caldwell offered, to choose his daughter's life over abstract principles about truth in history and obligations to the dead. You're asking me to betray everything my family stood for. I'm asking you to prioritize the living over the dead. Your grandfather made his choice. Vivian made hers. Those choices were valid for their circumstances. But circumstances change, Marcus. The Cold War is over. The existential threats that justified Site Baker no longer exist. Clinging to old missions doesn't make you loyal. It makes you obsolete. The door to the chamber opened. An elderly man entered, moving slowly, supporting himself with a cane. 70-plus years old, white hair, suit that had been expensive once but now showed signs of careful maintenance and repeated alterations. He paused when he saw Marcus and Caldwell, surprise crossing features that looked like they'd spent decades practicing neutrality. Mr. Caldwell, I didn't expect to find you here. The commission meeting isn't until 1. Caldwell's smile returned, professional and empty. Arthur, always a pleasure. I was just having a private conversation with Mr. Hayes. We'll be finished shortly. Arthur Pembroke. The name clicked from Vivian's ledger, from the entries describing who'd maintained the house, who'd kept the secret, who'd stood beside Vivian through 80 years of isolation. The former butler, current witness, living connection to everything Marcus was trying to understand. Arthur studied Marcus with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read people through decades of service. You're the heir, Vivian's nephew's boy. She spoke of you toward the end, said you had the look of Thomas about you. You knew my grandfather. I did, good man. Believed in duty the way most people believe in gravity, as a force that didn't require faith because it simply was. He and Vivian built Site Baker together, though most people don't remember his contribution. History has a way of simplifying narratives, erasing participants who complicate the story. Caldwell moved toward the door, making a show of checking his watch. Arthur, this really isn't the time. Mr. Hayes and I are in the middle of sensitive discussions. Arthur didn't move, didn't leave, just stood there, leaning on his cane, looking at Marcus with an intensity that suggested the interruption hadn't been accidental. Sensitive discussions about betraying Vivian's life work, I imagine. About convincing this young man to surrender what she spent 80 years protecting. About finishing what your grandfather started when he tried to steal from Site Baker. Caldwell's expression hardened, polish cracking just enough to reveal something colder underneath. My grandfather tried to return improperly sequestered assets to federal custody. He followed protocols, acted within his authority, and was railroaded by a woman whose mental state was questionable at best. Your grandfather tried to embezzle $5 billion by falsifying transfer orders and claiming emergency authorization he never actually possessed. Vivian caught him, documented his crimes, and forced him into retirement rather than prosecution. She showed him mercy he didn't deserve and certainly hadn't earned. The chamber felt smaller suddenly, air heavier. The space between the three men charged with tensions that had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with debts carried across generations. Marcus looked at Arthur, seeing in the old man's posture something familiar. The stance of someone who'd held positions past the point where relief arrived, who'd stood watch because the alternative was abandoning the post, and abandoning the post wasn't something you did if you wanted to look at yourself afterward. Why did you stay? Why help Vivian all those years? Arthur's smile was slight, touched with sadness that looked permanent. Because she asked, because the work mattered, because someone had to remember that not everything worth protecting shows up in bank accounts or stock portfolios. Some things are worth guarding precisely because they're difficult, because they cost more than they return, because they demand and we become better than our circumstances want us to be. Caldwell made a dismissive sound. Poetic, but poetry doesn't feed children or pay medical bills. Marcus needs practical solutions, not philosophical romanticism from someone who spent his life serving a woman too proud to admit her mission had expired. Arthur turned to Caldwell, cane tapping the floor with slow deliberation. And you, Richard, need to understand that not all inheritances come in forms you can liquidate. Your grandfather left you his obsession, his resentment, his certainty that being thwarted meant being wronged. You've spent 15 years trying to correct what you perceive as injustice, when in truth you're just angry that someone told your family no. That's not legacy, that's just ego with better lawyers. Marcus watched Caldwell absorb the accusation, watch calculation replace anger, watch the man remember he was in a public building where witnesses and security cameras might make certain responses inadvisable. Arthur, you've served the Thorne family faithfully. I respect that loyalty even when I disagree with its object. But loyalty to the dead shouldn't trump responsibility to the living. Marcus has a daughter who needs surgery. Continuing this fight means she dies while he wages a war he can't win. Is that really what Vivian would have wanted? Her nephew's grandchild sacrificed to maintain empty symbolism? The question landed with weight Marcus felt physically, because it was the right question, the one that mattered, the one that cut through all the arguments about history and duty and legacy to the only thing that actually counted. Sophie, sleeping in a hospital, heart failing, future measured in days rather than years. Arthur turned to Marcus, meeting his eyes with understanding that acknowledged the weight without trying to lift it. Vivian knew the cost of her choices, knew they hurt people who didn't deserve hurting. She told me once, near the end, that she'd made peace with being remembered as the crazy old woman who died alone because being remembered kindly would have meant failing the mission. She chose the mission. That was her right. But it doesn't have to be yours. You have a daughter. You have a life separate from these obligations. Walking away doesn't make you a coward. It makes you a father. The permission landed harder than the accusation would have, because Arthur wasn't trying to manipulate or coerce or threaten. He was offering genuine release, acknowledgement that Marcus didn't owe Vivian anything, didn't owe Thomas anything, didn't owe history or legacy or duty anything that cost more than he could afford to pay. But permission to surrender only mattered if surrender was something Marcus could live with afterward. He thought about Thomas Hayes standing beside Vivian in that photograph, thought about his grandfather choosing to build Site Baker, knowing it meant secrets kept from family, knowing it meant carrying weight others wouldn't understand. Thomas had been a father, had presumably loved his children, wanted their respect, tried to be present in their lives. But he'd still made the choice to help create something designed to outlast him, to matter beyond his personal concerns. What had Thomas seen that made that choice feel necessary? What had he known that Marcus didn't? Arthur, why did they build Site Baker? Really? Not the official reason, but the actual motivation. The old man moved to one of the chamber seats, lowering himself carefully, cane propped against armrest. Because they'd seen what happened when nations fell. Thomas had been in North Africa, seen Rome occupied, seen civilizations that had stood for millennia reduced to battlegrounds where children starved while armies fought over ruins. Vivian had lost her father in Normandy, understood that victory wasn't guaranteed, that everything everyone took for granted could vanish overnight if the wrong side won. Arthur paused, gathering thoughts that clearly still carried emotional weight despite decades of distance. They built Site Baker because they wanted insurance, not against losing the war. By 1943, it was clear we'd win eventually, but against losing everything, against the possibility that even winning might cost so much that the country couldn't recover, couldn't rebuild, couldn't maintain the systems that separated civilization from collapse. They wanted to ensure that no matter what happened, no matter how dark things got, there would be resources held back from the immediate fight. Resources that could be used for the afterward, for the recovery, for the rebuilding that matters more than any individual battle. Marcus absorbed this, fitting it against what he'd seen in the microfilm, against Vivian's letter, against the entire architecture of Site Baker. So the gold was never about wealth. The gold was about options, about ensuring that future generations would have choices available, even if the present generation exhausted every resource fighting for survival. It was an act of profound optimism disguised as paranoid preparation. They believed the country was worth saving and worth rebuilding and worth planning for, even when planning seemed absurd. Caldwell made another dismissive sound. Beautiful sentiment, irrelevant now. The scenarios they planned for didn't happen. The Cold War ended peacefully. The systems held, which means the insurance policy expired without ever being needed, and continuing to pay premiums on expired insurance is the definition of waste. Arthur shook his head, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. The policy didn't expire, Richard. It matured. Site Baker isn't about World War II anymore. It's about the precedent, about the principle that nations should plan for disaster even when disaster seems impossible, about maintaining the capacity to think beyond immediate crises to structural resilience. Your grandfather understood that initially. He helped create the systems that made Site Baker viable. But then he decided those systems were more valuable as assets to be liquidated than as insurance to be maintained. And Vivian stopped him because she understood that some things stop working the moment you try to monetize them. The argument felt circular, two positions that couldn't be reconciled because they started from incompatible premises. Caldwell believed value meant liquidity. Arthur believed value meant function. Neither could convince the other because they were speaking different languages that happened to use the same words. Marcus stood between them, literally and figuratively, trying to find ground that reconciled the need to save his daughter with the obligation to honor commitments he hadn't chosen but had inherited anyway. What if I gave you the gold but kept the microfilm? Both men turned to him, surprise mirrored in expressions that suggested this possibility hadn't been considered. The microfilm matters, you said, contains information that's sensitive, potentially damaging. So make it public, release everything, make the historical record complete. Let people decide for themselves what it means. In return, you get the gold. You can liquidate it, profit from it, do whatever serves your conception of productive use. But the truth stays available. The actual history doesn't get buried to protect people who are probably dead anyway. Caldwell's laugh held no humor. That's not a compromise, Marcus. That's you taking the only thing I actually want and offering me something I can get anyway once I control the site. The gold is leverage to get the microfilm. Separating them defeats the purpose. Then you don't actually care about productive use or helping the country. You care about controlling the narrative, about making sure your grandfather's version of events becomes the official version, because the alternative is admitting he was wrong. The accusation hung in the air, crystallizing motivations that had been obscured by rhetoric. Caldwell's face closed, professional mask sliding back into place, but not fast enough to hide the truth underneath. He wasn't fighting for the gold. He was fighting for vindication, for the ability to rewrite history so that his grandfather became the wronged hero instead of the failed thief. The gold was just the means to that end, the leverage needed to ensure silence from people who remembered differently. Arthur stood, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose body hurt but refused to acknowledge limitations. You should leave now, Richard. You're not going to get what you want through conversation, and threatening this young man in a public building would be inadvisable even for someone with your resources. Caldwell looked at Marcus, calculation visible in the assessment. You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that, I'll proceed through legal channels that will take everything you have and leave you with nothing but the satisfaction of having been stubborn. Your daughter will die because you chose pride over practicality. Think about that tonight. Think about whether Vivian's approval is worth Sophie's life. He left, footsteps echoing through the empty chamber, door closing with finality that promised the conversation wasn't over despite ending. Arthur waited until the sound faded before speaking. He's right about one thing: you can't beat him in court. He has judges in his pocket, lawyers on retainer, political connections that reach federal levels. If this becomes a legal battle, you lose. So what do I do? You make it not a legal battle. You make it public, loud, impossible to silence without drawing attention that even Caldwell's resources can't manage. You take the microfilm to media outlets, release everything simultaneously, create a situation where suppression becomes more expensive than accommodation. Marcus thought about the hospital, about Sophie monitored and medicated and stable only because nurses were working overtime to maintain equipment that translated heartbeats into evidence of continued existence. I do that, I become a target. Not just me, but Sophie. Caldwell made that clear. He'll use her as leverage, make sure she suffers because I wouldn't cooperate. Arthur nodded, acknowledging the threat without minimizing it. That's the choice Vivian faced every day. Stay silent and stay safe, or speak truth and accept consequences. She chose truth, cost her everything that made life comfortable, but it let her sleep at night, let her face herself in the mirror, let her die knowing she'd kept faith with people who trusted her. Vivian didn't have a daughter dying of heart failure. No, she had different costs, different pressures, different nightmares. But the essential choice was the same. Betray your obligations to protect yourself, or honor your obligations despite the cost. There's no right answer, Marcus. Just different kinds of wrong that you live with differently. Marcus moved to the window, looking down at the street. People walked past the courthouse, ordinary citizens navigating ordinary days, oblivious to the weight being negotiated in the chamber above. They didn't know about Site Baker, didn't care about microfilm or gold or 80-year-old promises. They just lived, struggled, tried to survive their own battles against systems that didn't care whether they won or lost. Sophie was one of those people. 4 years old and already fighting harder than most adults fought in their entire lives, struggling for breath, for heartbeats, for the simple continuation of existence that healthy people took for granted. Saving her meant surrendering, meant letting Caldwell win, letting history get rewritten, letting truth become whatever served the convenience of people who'd never faced consequences for their choices. But saving Site Baker meant risking Sophie, meant continuing a fight that might cost her the time she needed for surgery, for recovery, for the life she deserved. Some choices, Marcus realized, couldn't be made rationally, couldn't be calculated or optimized or reasoned through to correct conclusions. Some choices just had to be made, and you lived with the aftermath regardless of whether you'd chosen right. He turned from the window, meeting Arthur's patient gaze. I need to see the house. Need to go back to Iron Gate Manor, see what I'm actually fighting for. Can you take me there? Arthur's expression suggested this was both expected and concerning. The contractors are still present, Caldwell's people. Going back means confronting them directly. Then we confront them. But I need to see the whole picture, need to understand what Vivian protected before I decide whether it's worth protecting now. The drive took 40 minutes. Arthur's ancient sedan climbing mountain roads with the reluctant determination of machinery that worked primarily through habit. They didn't talk much, both men conserving energy for confrontations that waited ahead. Marcus thought about Ranger, about the dog he'd abandoned when the floor collapsed, hoping the contractors had shown enough humanity to not hurt an animal that hadn't actually threatened them. Iron Gate Manor appeared through the trees exactly as Marcus remembered from 2 days ago, which felt like a lifetime given everything that had happened since. The house stood unchanged, indifferent to human drama, solid in the way structures became solid after surviving more than a century of weather and war in the slow erosion of time. 2 vehicles sat in the driveway, contractors' trucks, expensive models with tinted windows and tactical equipment visible through the glass. 4 men stood near the entrance, armed but not overtly threatening, positioned to observe rather than prevent access. Arthur parked, killed the engine, made no move to exit immediately. They won't let you in. Caldwell's orders would be to prevent entry until ownership is legally transferred. Ownership is legally transferred. I signed in the papers. This is my property. According to Caldwell, your ownership is contingent on fulfilling obligations you haven't fulfilled. Tax payments, maintenance requirements, conditions that void the transfer if not met. He'll argue those conditions haven't been satisfied, which means the property reverts to the county, which means he gets first claim as the person who initiated the preservation application. Legal gymnastics, procedures twisted until they served whoever had better lawyers. Marcus understood the game without understanding the rules, which meant he was fighting with handicaps that might be insurmountable. But he'd driven 40 minutes to get here. Wasn't leaving without at least trying. He opened the car door, stepping out into cold that carried the promise of snow. The contractors noticed immediately, adjusting postures, hands moving closer to weapons without actually touching them. Professional restraint, the kind that came from training and rules of engagement that probably specified minimum force necessary. Marcus walked toward them, slowly, hands visible, body language broadcasting non-aggression. Arthur followed, cane tapping gravel, presence adding weight without adding threat. The lead contractor stepped forward, different man from yesterday, older, more experienced, carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd been doing this long enough to recognize when situations were about to complicate. Mr. Hayes, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This property is currently under legal review. Entry isn't authorized until ownership is finalized. I am the owner. I have documentation proving ownership. Whatever review you're talking about is bureaucratic theater designed to delay my access. Be that as it may, my instructions are clear. No entry until I receive authorization from Mr. Caldwell or the county commission. Marcus considered options. 4 armed men versus 1 veteran with a bad shoulder and an elderly butler. The math wasn't promising, but physical confrontation wasn't the only approach, wasn't even the smartest approach. Fine, we'll wait here until authorization arrives, but I need to know about my dog. German Shepherd, 3 years old, was inside the house when your people entered. Is he alive? Something shifted in the contractor's expression. Not guilt exactly, but acknowledgement that the question deserved an answer. The dog is secure. We had to tranquilize him after he attacked one of my men, but he's uninjured. He's in a kennel in the back of the property, under shelter, with food and water. Relief hit Marcus physically, tension releasing from muscles that had been clenched since the floor collapsed. Ranger was alive, was okay, could be recovered once this was resolved. I want to see him. That's not, I want to see my dog. You've detained him without cause, which is theft at minimum. Either let me verify his condition or explain to the police why you're holding stolen property. The contractor considered this, weighing instructions against exposure, calculating whether accommodation cost less than confrontation. After a moment, he nodded. 5 minutes, and you stay with me the entire time. No wandering, no attempting to access the house. They walked around to the rear of the property, following a path Marcus remembered from childhood visits. The kennel was exactly what the contractor had described. Chain link enclosure, weatherproof shelter, bowls for food and water. Ranger lay inside, alert but groggy, eyes tracking movement with recognition that sparked immediate response. The dog stood, wobbled slightly from whatever tranquilizer they'd used, pressed against the fence. Whining not with pain but with the desperate need to reach pack, to fulfill duties that didn't stop just because humans had interfered. Marcus knelt, reaching through the fence, letting Ranger lick his hand. The contact steadied something in Marcus's chest that had been tilting toward panic since the moment they'd separated. Good boy, you did good. Protected Sophie, held the line. I'm proud of you. Arthur stood nearby, watching with the expression of someone who understood that relationships between soldiers and their dogs transcended normal boundaries between species. That these partnerships were forged in circumstances where trust meant survival, and survival meant absolute loyalty. Vivian had a dog once. Different breed, different era, but same devotion. She said animals understood duty better than most humans because they didn't complicate it with philosophy. They just knew pack, knew protect, knew stay until relieved or dead. Marcus continued petting Ranger through the fence, feeling the dog's warmth, the solid reality of muscle and bone and heartbeat, feeling connected to something that didn't require explanation or justification or complicated moral calculation. Ranger didn't care about gold or microfilm or historical obligations. Ranger cared about pack, about keeping threats away from family, about doing his job because doing his job was what defined him. Simple, direct, unambiguous. Marcus envied that clarity even as he knew he couldn't access it. Humans didn't get simple choices, got nuance instead, got complications, Got situations where every option hurt someone, and all you could do was try to minimize the damage while hoping you weren't just rationalizing cowardice as wisdom. The contractor cleared his throat, impatient with sentiment. Time's up. You've seen the dog is fine. Now you need to leave. Marcus stood, took one more look at Ranger, made a promise the dog couldn't understand but that Marcus needed to articulate anyway. I'm coming back for you. This isn't over. They returned to the front of the house, Arthur moving more slowly now, Kane bearing more weight, age and exertion taking visible toll. The old man needed rest, probably needed medical attention himself, but kept moving through determination that looked painful to witness. Marcus was about to suggest they leave when another vehicle appeared on the access road. Not a contractor's truck, but a county sheriff's patrol car, lights inactive but presence deliberate. The car parked, driver emerging with the careful neutrality law enforcement adopted when walking into situations where everyone was probably wrong in different ways. Sheriff Rebecca Martinez, according to the badge. Mid-40s, compact, carrying herself with confidence that suggested she'd earned respect rather than inheriting it. She surveyed the scene with eyes that missed nothing, cataloging the contractors, the vehicles, Marcus and Arthur standing in positions that broadcast defensive posture without overt hostility. Gentlemen, I received a call about a property dispute that might require mediation. Anyone want to explain what's happening here? The lead contractor spoke first, establishing narrative before Marcus could complicate it. Sheriff Martinez, these men are attempting to access a property that's currently under legal review. My team has been contracted to maintain security until ownership is finalized. They're refusing to leave despite being informed entry isn't authorized. Martinez turned to Marcus, expression neutral but eyes sharp. Is that accurate? I own this property. I have documentation proving ownership. These men are preventing me from accessing my own house on the orders of someone who's trying to steal it through legal manipulation. You have the documentation with you? Marcus pulled out the folder Bryce had given him. Deed, transfer papers, notarized documents that looked official because they were official, because the transfer had been legitimate even if everything surrounding it was corrupted by agendas. Marcus was only beginning to understand. Martinez reviewed the papers, taking her time, checking details with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that surface legitimacy could hide substantive fraud. When she finished, she looked at the contractor. These documents appear valid. Unless you can produce a court order specifically preventing Mr. Hayes from accessing this property, I don't see legal justification for denying him entry. I have instructions from Richard Caldwell, who initiated the preservation application that triggered the legal review. Mr. Caldwell isn't a judge. Instructions from private citizens don't override property rights. Either produce documentation with judicial authority or stand down. The contractor's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone, making a call, speaking too quietly for Marcus to hear. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds before he disconnected, frustration visible in posture that had stiffened with tension. Mr. Caldwell is on his way. He requests that everyone remain present until he arrives to clarify the situation. Martinez nodded, unbothered by delay. We can wait, but nobody interferes with Mr. Hayes while we're waiting. He's free to access his property unless someone produces documentation saying otherwise. Marcus moved toward the house before anyone could complicate the permission. Arthur followed, and the contractors watched but didn't interfere. Authority of badge and gun, apparently sufficient to enforce compliance they hadn't shown when Marcus had asked alone. The interior was exactly as Marcus remembered. Cold, dusty, filled with the particular silence that came from spaces where people had stopped living but hadn't quite become tombs. He moved through rooms, seeing them differently now, understanding that these walls had stood watch, while Vivian maintained her vigil, while decades accumulated like the dust that covered every surface. The library where he'd found the journal, the living room where the fireplace held cold ash, the kitchen where the floor had collapsed and revealed the first evidence that something worth protecting lay hidden in the foundations. Each space was a chapter in a story Marcus was only beginning to read, a history that connected his grandfather to his great-aunt, to himself through links of duty and sacrifice, and choices that echoed across generations. Arthur stopped in the library, moving to a specific section of shelving. He pulled a book, not opening it but using it to trigger some mechanism Marcus couldn't see. A panel swung open, revealing another hidden compartment. Inside was more documentation, photographs, letters, a different journal than the one Marcus had already found. Vivian kept redundant records. She learned early that single points of failure meant mission failure. These are copies of everything that's in Site Baker, everything on the microfilm, transcribed and preserved in case the facility was compromised. Marcus took the journal, opening it to find page after page of coded entries that looked similar to what he'd already seen. But near the back, in clear text, was a section titled simply Testament. He read it standing there, absorbing words Vivian had written specifically for whoever inherited her burden. If you're reading this, you found the house, found the vault, found the weight I carried. You're probably wondering if it was worth it. If my life justified the isolation, the poverty, the surrender of everything that makes existence comfortable. I can't answer that for you. I can only say that I made a choice every day. Could have walked away, could have taken the gold, could have lived in comfort while letting the secret die. But I didn't. Because Thomas taught me that some promises can't be broken without breaking yourself in the process. The gold matters less than what it represents. The microfilm matters less than what it proves. What matters is the principle that nations plan for the future, even when the future seems secure. That insurance only works if you maintain the policy before you need it, not after the disaster strikes. You'll be tempted to surrender. I was tempted every day for 80 years. The temptation doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. But being human also means you can choose to be more than your immediate needs. You can choose to honor obligations that cost more than they return. You can choose to become the person who stands the watch others refuse. That's what duty means, not following orders, but choosing sacrifice when easier options exist. Not blind obedience, but conscious commitment to principles that transcend personal comfort. I didn't die poor. I died rich in knowledge that I'd kept faith with people who trusted me. That's a wealth no one can tax, no one can steal, no one can diminish unless you let them. Stand your ground. The wolves at the door are always hungry. Feed them nothing. Marcus finished reading as he heard vehicles approaching outside. Multiple vehicles, engines loud in the mountain silence. Caldwell had arrived, and he'd brought reinforcements. The confrontation was about to escalate, and Marcus still didn't know which side he was on.